Welcome to the Drinks and Diplomacy podcast, where we are cheersing to understanding the United Nations. You may know me already, but if you're just joining the conversation for the first time, my name is Tim Horgan, and I am the Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire. I am also one of the co-hosts of this amazing series of discussions designed to provide you with the insights needed to understand how foreign affairs works. Today, we are talking about the United Nations, that global organization which is one of the most ambitious peace-building initiatives the world has ever undertaken. However, these days many people in various countries around the world have begun to question the effectiveness of this global body, particularly in light of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. As always, here with me today is my wonderful co-host,
Andrea Vanessa Castillo. I am a program officer at World Oregon, and I am so excited to be here with you today.
Great to be here for another really exciting conversation, and we're very honored to have former Ambassador Dick Swett with us here today. We'll get into Dick's background here in a moment. But again, as always, this is the Drinks and Diplomacy podcast.
Yes.
So why don't we start off with our drinks for the day? And Dick, we'll kick it over to you to let you have the first shot at this.
Well, it's great to be with you. Thank you very much. And I actually could have used this drink I'm about to purport or promote for our conversation over the last several days, because we just got 20 inches of snow up here on the hilltop, and I was busy out there doing the snow blowing, and also got in a half day of skiing yesterday in the deep POW, which is
Good.
a lot better than I've had around here lately. So it's a 5-hour energy drink, is
There
the
you
drink
go.
I bring to. And when you look at everything that the UN is having to deal with and trying to deal with, and boy, I'll tell you, you need that kind of continuous high level energy. And I don't know if a 5-hour energy drink will even accomplish a fraction of that, but it's a start at least.
Well, we know that many diplomats have gone on for more than 5 hours at the UN. I think
Yes.
the record is somewhere around 8 hours nonstop continuous talking, which is quite impressive. I can't imagine anybody actually having that much to say, but a little bit of
I don't think
Mr.
they
Smith
did.
goes to
I think
Washington.
that's part of the trick to it.
Andrea, how about you? What did you bring today?
Yeah. Okay. So I've been very excited for this particular episode to talk about the United Nations and to really go into understanding how can we communicate what's going on in this entity and the way that we're engaging with the world. And so I was thinking to myself, what drink would kind of encompass and embody this episode for me? And so I was thinking about a couple cocktails, and I was like, oh, hello, a mojito would be a perfect drink for this one, thinking about international cocktails and things. So Cuba, by my understanding, joined the United Nations in 1945, I believe. And so I was like, you know what, that would be a perfect drink for me to have today. So I, made myself a little mojito today, and it's one of my household's favorite drinks. My family uses a little crusher for the mint. That's very important for us when we're making this drink. And so I am by no means a cocktail connoisseur, but I know that I use that little smusher for our smusher. Is that a term?
Sure, why not?
But we use it for making the mojitos. And so sometimes, my fiance will get a little fancy and put some raspberry in there, just depending on the day. But
Sure.
yeah, that's the drink I have today. And what about you, Tim?
Well, I went very literal here. I wanted a cocktail because I think cocktails fit nicely with the UN diplomats and, talking over high things in smoky rooms, or I guess perhaps in the past smoky rooms. But
Yeah, I don't think you can find a lot of smoke this time.
yeah, but where is the UN located, headquartered? Nowhere else but Manhattan. So I went with a nice Manhattan, some bourbons, some vermouth, and some bitters. And of course, who doesn't love a little maraschino cherry in there as well? So that's what I went with. Pretty straightforward, but I think appropriate for what we're talking about today.
Well, you've been notorious for literal drinks. You had the diplomat cocktail one episode, I remember. So this is very on par. This is great.
Yeah. Well, gotta stay consistent, right? All right. So I want to take a moment before we dive into the conversation to give a little bit of background about Ambassador Swett here. Dick grew up in the New Hampshire area and is an architect by training, but served in the U.S. Congress for a number of years in the 1990s, was ambassador to Denmark, or was it one term, Dick?
One term.
One
Yes.
term, yes. Many of his children have continued to live over there, but I think they're all back now.
Everybody's back, and they're starting now to come back to New Hampshire, which is great fun. So
Yeah.
we're working on 8 grandkids close by, and well, we've got 2 more on the way. They're not here yet, but the grand total we have to get back to New Hampshire is 16 so far. So
Wow, that's amazing.
we're doing well with 8. So
There you go. Halfway
we're
there.
happy with that.
Yeah. And for those who have listened to the Global and the Granite State podcast previously, you may recall that Dick was a athlete in his earlier years, competing or trying to prepare for the Olympics, and has served on the International Olympic Committee as well. So someone with a great set of international experiences who I think will really be able to give us a really good insight to what the UN is, what it does, why it's here, and where it's going. So Dick, why don't we start off with just sort of a brief overview of the history of the UN and why it was created?
Well, I think the first thing I have to say is that I'm actually not a staunch critic, but I am a critic of the United Nations. I think there are a lot of issues that need to be fixed. It's been interesting. The last 10 years of my career, I've been working on designing and developing new communities in Africa. And the amount of corruption, the amount of graft, the amount of just obscure and obtuse politics that one has to engage with in Africa is not really unlike what the UN poses as an institution as well. And one of my more direct involvement with the UN was leading what is called an architectural charrette. That's not a term that diplomats use, but I conducted an architectural charrette, which is an intense day and a half meeting to try and do a problem-solving exercise with regard to architecture. I was doing this for the State Department, the top 25 people at the State Department, just after 9/11. And the ultimate result of that was coming up with a coalition of the 41 countries that were willing to sign on and support the United States in the General Assembly. So that kind of is the backdoor entry into my dealing with the United Nations. But it was formed in 1945 after the Second World War, really on the tail end and actually causing the demise of the League of Nations. And one of the things that was going on, obviously, is that there was a great need for a forum in which communication could continue between all the nations that were dealing with the Second World War. And the League of Nations, in its worst moment, was when it was appeasing Hitler before the Second World War began. It was doing all the wrong things. And the other thing that I discovered that really was fascinating to me, because I learned about this dealing as ambassador in Denmark, the United Nations was a unanimous consent-driven organization. And the League of Nations in a unanimous consent environment, especially when there was no strong leadership, the United States was not prominently positioned, nor was the UK, nor was Russia and China. There wasn't a Security Council, so there was no strong positioned council that could force the debate to take one direction or another. And when everybody had to agree, it just watered down every decision so that it really made no sense whatsoever. And that applied to what I was doing in Denmark. If you didn't build a coalition, you have very little power, very little clout. And a unanimous consent institution, particularly in the League of Nations, it was a process that ensured that no real meaningful decisions could be made. And I think that the EU is continuing to struggle with that same problem, but the United Nations is a majority-ruled institution. It has strong countries at the top. The United Nations, China, and Japan are supplying, well over 60%, 70% of the funding. These are things that drive that institution. And so I can start out on a positive note that at least it has a decision-making process that can make real and substantive decisions. And we'll talk about all the other problematic aspects of it as we go along.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that I'll get into this a little bit later, but pretty clear with the Security Council these days and Russia, China, and the US on very different sides of things,
Yes.
making things very difficult to get through. But it is nice that there are opportunities for some things to get done and some agreement to be made. So one thing that I think you've kind of touched on there, but just like to dive a little deeper into is what has made the UN last longer, be more effective, if you will, than the League of Nations. Anything you want to add there?
Yeah, sure. If you keep a 30,000-foot view of things, obviously the goals that have been laid down for the United Nations to try and uphold are all laudable. I mean, keeping peace, that's absolutely an imperative. Developing friendly relations between nations, acting as a town square, if you will, or a public square where everybody can come and voice their concerns and work together. I think that's very important. Eliminating poverty, working for the poor, it's a great goal. They haven't accomplished it yet, but it certainly is important for that. And also working together in economic development. They have like 8 different things that they specifically are trying to accomplish: the peace and security, the economic development, the social development. These are important goals that they are trying to uphold: human rights, the environment, international law, humanitarian affairs, and lastly, health. I mean, that's why you need the energy drink. I mean, there is so much in all of those 8 different topics that you couldn't even begin to accomplish those, even if you had a perfectly working administrative process, which they don't have. I mean, that's where the real problems start to expose themselves.
Well, can we go a little bit deeper into, you were talking about the decision-making body and the process that they have for coming to any sort of conclusion on these really big topics. Can we break down a little bit how the United Nations works in the subcommittees that are a part of these sustainable development and climate action projects, international law projects, just to kind of get an understanding of the way that the United Nations kind of works in that capacity?
Sure. Well, the General Assembly is kind of like the Congress of the United States. For the United States, the General Assembly is the meeting, the general meeting for all the members of the United Nations. And they are the ones that offer whatever it is. You know, as I said, I worked with the resolution to form the coalition of the 41 countries that supported the United States after the 9/11 attack. But they are the ones that build these broad general requests or efforts that try to address these particular things. When you talk about the subcommittees, there are really 4 that you're really talking about. You talk about the Security Council, and Tim's already pointed out the real problems right now that the Security Council has. It really is dysfunctional if it's functioning at all. And that is because the United States, China, and Russia are all permanent members of the Security Council. So they all have veto rights, and anyone who lifts a finger against one or another of those 3 in particular will get vetoed by one or the other of those 3 that are being called out. So
Dick, real quick there. Are you willing to give up U.S. veto power in order, if China and Russia were willing, and all the other security permanent members willing to give up their permanent vetoes as well?
No, and I'll tell you why. Because that's where the problems with the institution begin to take shape. If you look at what the body of the United Nations in the General Assembly, among all the countries that are involved, how they are involved, many of them, and it's often a majority, are against the positions that the United States takes. And I'm not saying that the United States is right all the time, but it is certainly not wrong all the time. And there are many who are doing things that either have to do with anti-Semitism or have to do with human rights issues or have to do with, you name it. There are any number of reasons why these people are having a conniption fit about one item or another that is being debated at the United Nations. And without someone or something having some control over this group of children, that's not going to really foster a direction or a constructive debate in the long run. So I think that the problem has less to do with the US veto or even the China or the Russian veto, then it has to do with the ethics of the participants. And that kind of gets us more into the weeds, as Andrea liked to say, about how the United Nations operates. And one of the problems that the United Nations has is lack of transparency. Here you've got, it's the best job for most people in the countries that are represented in the United Nations, which is predominantly all the countries in the world. It is the best job, including president or anything else, that those people could ever have. And so they want to keep their job. And to do that, they've got to talk back to their constituency instead of, working out solutions to these conflicts and debates that are causing the conflicts within the institution. But most importantly, they don't want to leave their apartments in New York. They don't want to leave the cushy life that they've got, working in the United Nations. And how do they keep that? Well, they keep that by certainly talking to their constituents more than working with the people beside them in the General Assembly Hall. Not unlike what happens in Congress because of gerrymandering. Everybody's only talking back to their constituency and they're not working with the other side of the aisle and solving the problems that the nation faces. The other thing is that they don't want any transparency because then they become accountable. And then they have to justify what decisions they're making and what payments they're receiving and all the other things that are part of the program. And I think that transparency is absolutely essential for fixing the institution. So you have administrative accountability issues, you have transparency. Those are the kinds of things that need to be fixed. The next is, what is the architecture of the institution? Well, we have the Security Council, we have the UNHCR, which deals with refugees, we have the General Assembly, we have the International Court of Justice, so that's one that the United States isn't involved in. And for the same reason that you were implying earlier, Tim, that we should forego our veto, or would we consider that? When you're a member of the ICJ, you are subject to the determinations by the ICJ that you may be a war criminal or you may be doing something else that's wrong that has to do with human rights or whatever. And that goes back to my earlier comment that the majority of the countries in the United Nations are anti-American. And so there's a very likely chance that there would be very strong legal arguments brought against the United States. And if we were a member, we would have to comply with their demands. And their demands, if you look at them very closely, you'll find are very unreasonable and ill-founded and detrimental to the overall stability and structure of the world. So that's another institution that we've chosen out of the UN not to participate in. And then you have the WHO, and we've heard a lot about the WHO recently because of the COVID thing. And what's happening? Well, as I started out talking, the three main funders of the United Nations are the United States, China, and Japan. Why? Because we have the three biggest economies in the world. And so the way the funding for the United Nations is determined, the formula is to look at who's got the biggest economy, and they put the largest amount of money into the supporting of the institution. Problem is, when COVID hit, because China is making such a big contribution to the WHO talked about this being a bat that flew into a wet market. And now we're starting to hear that maybe it wasn't a natural occurrence. Maybe this thing came out of a lab in Wuhan, and maybe that's what started this whole pandemic globally. And the reason that wasn't discussed was because the Chinese were paying off the WHO to stay away and not to look into the other possibilities that the spread of COVID might have been caused by. So that is another problem that, is one of the corrections that need to take place. Beyond that, we need to strengthen the conflict prevention mechanisms and engagement processes. And the other thing is that there needs to be a high-level coordinator. There has to be, just as the United States and the Security Council are high-level possessors of vetoes that hopefully are there to keep the train from running off the tracks, if you will. There's not really any one individual that has the kind of authority that could keep the United Nations moving in consistent direction. Yes, there's the Secretary General, and his main influence is over the General Assembly, but that is not where the real work gets done. And he is not possessing of the kind of authority that is really necessary to sort of keep this thing in line and keep everybody working towards common goals.
Yeah, so there's a lot there, but I want to key back in on when you were talking about the International Court of Justice and the reasons why the U.S. is not a part of that. And it harkens back to, I think, why the U.S. did not get involved with the League of Nations, the idea of giving up our sovereignty to an international organization that we wouldn't have full control over and could be subject to things we don't like. Can you talk a little bit about why the U.S. did give up that sovereignty and whether or not it remains in our interest to continue to be in that spot while being a part of the overall UN, not necessarily just the International Court of Justice?
Yeah, and this sets up a real conflict or a dichotomy, if you will, that has been and continues to be a very difficult juggling act for the United States to participate in. I think that if you look at the global makeup of all the countries around the world, you will not find a country like the United States anywhere else. We have a special role to play. It is a role that is becoming more and more difficult to play because we ourselves are succumbing to some of the temptations and the faults that have plagued other nations throughout their existence. That happens because of time and the degradation of institutions. Temptations set in and sloppiness occurs, and there are all kinds of reasons. And this is one of the reasons why we see such a divided electorate in our country right now. But this is worldwide. I've traveled the world over, and leadership throughout this globe is deteriorating. And I don't know how we're going to pull back and reinforce the good ethics, the good rules and principles that once were stronger and more dominant in the United States. But that's, I think, one of the real challenges that we face is that we don't want to submit ourselves to an institution that could potentially be controlled by people with much lower ethics and much darker motivations. And so we have to stay separate from that, but we don't want to be totally disengaged because that will, in fact, cause us to lose control of and therefore see this all kind of come apart before our eyes. And that's the challenge.
Well, one of the things that you said earlier kind of stuck out to me in this conversation of really figuring out how we can take the next steps and move forward here, right? Is that piece of accountability and transparency, right? Being able to say that leadership here in the United States and around the world, being able to take this understanding and legitimacy that comes with holding ourselves accountable across the globe, I think is going to be really integral in the ways that we're moving forward and progressing as a nation, as a global community, right? And so kind of going along those lines, really wanting to think about what perspectives you have on what would really take the United Nations to that next step. What would it take for the members of the UN, for the community that's looking to the United Nations to be that leader in that sector? What are a couple of things that might contribute to that betterment of the institution?
Well, as I mentioned, obviously transparency is one of the things, and that has a very simple test. If you confront the person that you're arguing with, the challenge to have them reveal their sources of information as you are willing to reveal your sources of information. When you make things transparent, it's very difficult for people to find cover. And I typically, in my debates and in my negotiations in Africa, I find that it's more difficult sitting at one end of the table, watching people fight amongst themselves because they have no trust of each other on the other side of the table, than I have at convincing them to be transparent with me and me with them. So, we have a long way to go in that regard. That's obviously very, very true. The other thing is that defining accountability is very difficult. So if you have transparency, the old saying is what, there's statistics, my statistics are different than your statistics, even though they are the identical numbers, and we're coming up with different conclusions. That's where the world is right now. And it's very difficult to get people to agree on what the facts are, especially since fake news has become sort of the rage of the time, or the era. So those are the kinds of changes that are most difficult and are going to have the greatest impact. How do you get around that? Well, the only way that I think you can get around that is that you have to drive hard on relationships. And that's why I've been working in Africa for 10 years. The old saying is you got to eat a meal under the banyan tree in order to understand, or walk a mile in my moccasins, or whatever saying you'd like to use. But the point is, you have to get to know the people you're talking to. And you have to understand their culture. You have to understand their history. You have to understand what's motivating them right now to do what they want to do right now. And unless you can establish that relationship, where at any point in time, you might come up against something and you just have to look at them and you say, you got to trust me on this. And that's not working anywhere. Not right now, not anywhere. I haven't seen it. It certainly isn't working in our Congress. But when's the last time you looked at someone, you were trying to talk with them to resolve a difference, or to make a choice that was the two of you could go forward on, and you look at them and you say, you got to trust me on this one, and mean it, that it's a sincere request that they have to accept. It's really hard to do that now. The longer you know them, or the way that I would really like to see politicians run their races, instead of making the big promise that's at the end of the rainbow, rather tell me, what are the small steps you're going to take to get there? And which ones can we succeed at the most quickly, so that I know that we're making progress in that right direction? Those are the ways that I become trusting of someone. They tell me something's going to happen. We work together and it happens. And it happens quickly, in a week, in a month, in 2 months. But those are the things that have to be part of this administrative architecture I was talking about earlier, that sets out small steps with a big goal at the end. But those small steps are like climbing a stair to get to that goal, as opposed to just saying, oh, we're going to eradicate poverty from the world. And for the last 50 years, we've spent $3 trillion in Africa and nothing has changed. So that's not the way to do it. But if you can build a community here, if you can bring technology there, if you can set up ways to deal with health and human services in some other location, each one of those things begins to build the momentum, and most importantly, the trust that the locals have in the institution that's providing the services. Then they can start to see, hey, my life is getting better. I'm willing to trust you when you say trust me. And that's the hard work that takes a lot of time, a lot of patience, and a lot of compassion. But you've got to work with the other side in a way that gives them respect, and also the space to accept what you're offering over a period of time.
There's definitely a lot of trust that needs to be built in the world in many ways, many shapes and forms. But I like that you sort of got into where I'd like to head this conversation next as we begin to sort of wrap up. But you talk about how, you got to build trust with local communities so that they know that the UN is there to help. Can you talk a little bit about how the UN impacts our daily lives? It seems like this big, huge, amorphous blob of an organization that is just sort of talking about these high level issues. But can you bring it down to the everyday level?
Yeah, well, in the United States, it's not a positive way that it impacts our lives, because all you hear are people talking about, well, that's my tax dollars going into this big, huge organization. These people live in these really nice, cushy apartments in New York. They never want to leave, then blah, 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 blah. I mean, that's the unfortunate reality, except that if the United Nations were to constrict its scope a little bit, maybe a little bit more, and start laying out ways that it can prove that it is having a positive impact in the world, then we Americans would feel like our money is being well spent and is having a positive impact. And that's something that I think we have to challenge the United Nations to take a look at itself and make changes that will enable that to happen.
So can I just hop in here?
Go ahead.
One of the arguments made for the successes of the UN is that we've seen one of the longest timeframes of international peace, which of course has been currently disrupted by the invasion of Ukraine. Since the start of the UN, you had wars in that time frame, but we did not return for World War III, at least not yet.
Nope.
So what assessment would you have on that in terms of impact that the UN may have had on people's lives?
Well, first of all, let me bring it down even to a more personal level and say, this is the reason why I'm a member of the World Affairs Council in New Hampshire. The World Affairs Council is an eye into, is a peephole, if you will, into the United Nations. And we are trying to do things through education and discussions with the World Affairs Council that is, very small, very local, and with no political import or impact at all, except that we are able to build relationships. And that's what the International Visitor Program is all about. That is what, getting the business community that is doing work internationally is all about. But it's all about the relationships, and it's all about finding the little steps that we can be taking together to ultimately build a bigger and broader understanding. So step back from that and look at the United Nations. Are they doing something? Yes, with the Children's Relief Fund, the poverty program at the FAO. I mean, there are any number of programs where they are making a difference, but they're really putting Band-Aids over wounds instead of, changing the way people live and the course of history so that people can live better lives. That's the harder stuff. That's where you need the 5-hour energy drink. But they're trying to do these things. But I think, as I said earlier, they need to change how they measure them. They need to change how they lay them out. They need to change who they work with and how they work with them to get them to accomplish things. And if they do that, if they can focus their scope and shorten the milestones and the steps they're taking so that people can see success being obtained, I think they have the opportunity of becoming a much better accepted and much greater supported institution. But right now, they are kind of like all political institutions, they are at their nadir because the public is sick and tired of seeing things not work, and they want change. They want to see things happen, and it's not happening yet.
So this is going to be really embarrassing, but really quickly, they just need to listen to Taylor Swift, who says Band-Aids don't fix bullet holes.
Yes.
Well, I think she got that from someone probably
there you go.
far more knowledgeable, but she can repeat that in her songs as much as she wants, because I think she's absolutely right.
And it'll reach a wide variety of audiences that way. And
yeah, but Andrea, think about this. Think about the UNFAO. That's the food organization that is trying to supply, food. Their job is to feed 800 million people worldwide every day. And the problem that they have is that they're buying corn from the United States to send to Africa. They should be growing that food in the country where the starvation or the famine is affecting the population. And they're starting to do this. And, under David Beasley, who is a good friend of mine, who's heading the food organization right now, he's going to step down in April. But they are looking at how can they get countries like Sudan to produce that food for the people in that Eastern African area. But they're not doing it fast enough, and they're not really accomplishing it to the level, nor are they laying out, as I keep saying, they're laying out the milestones that will enable that to happen.
And I think that's the key point of one of the things that you just said right now, really stuck out to is how are we going to get X country to be doing this thing, right? It's that community engagement, really intentionally going to the folks that we're trying to serve and trying to engage and progress and support the progress for. It's that person to person, community to community, not just one entity telling this other community that this is what needs to happen. It's working together to really coalesce, to the coalition building, to support and engage and develop and work towards the growth is what I'm hearing. It's exactly what I'm hearing you say. It's how are we intentionally working within the communities to support those communities rather than coming with an outside plan that is determined in whatever way separate from the issue that's actually happening.
Yeah, and I think that's a great way to sort of sum up what we've been talking about here is that the UN as an institution has, a great mandate and they're really trying to accomplish some amazing things. But there are, of course, problems with that. And we need to rely on the community. We need to rely on building trust. We need to build new forms and new institutions and new ways to tackle these problems in a way that really is inclusive and values everyone's agency, I think, is really an important part of this as well.
I had two questions when I was in Congress that I asked. Is it on time? Is it on budget? And if I got a no to either one, I said, let's have a hearing and find out why. That's what someone needs to do at the UN. You've got to start by making them accountable for whatever it is they're doing.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Dick, for your time and your insights. We really appreciate it. We hope that people have learned a little bit more about the importance of the UN, some of the challenges that it's facing today, and some of the ways that it might be improved. We are not a partisan organization, either the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire or World Oregon. So we're not going to tell you guys what to do with this information, but we do hope that you take this information and take whatever actions you think are necessary and appropriate. Now, before we leave, Dick, we always like to end our show with a little cheers. But we, of course, being international organizations, leave it to you to decide which language or culture or whatever it may be you want to choose your cheers from. So we like to do a little countdown, a 3, 2, 1, and then we'll say your cheers in whatever way you would like. So, we ready?
I'm ready.
All right, you got your 5-hour energy ready? I hope we're getting a sponsorship from.
I don't have. I'll use.
Dick, no one can see you, so just pretend.
Okay. See, I'm being too transparent.
There you go. All right, great. Well, we ready? 3, 2, 1. Slancha.
Hello.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for.
Oh, wait. So everybody's got to explain where their cheer came from.
Sure.
So obviously, Skål, that's from Denmark. That's where I served my ambassadorship.
Kind of figured that's the way you would go. My grandfather's from Ireland, so Slancha for me from Ireland.
And then salud, our cheers in Spanish.
There you go.
There we go. Good.
All the cultural heritages. Perfect.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for taking a listen today. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and we hope that you'll take a listen to the other ones in our series. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
The Drinks and Diplomacy podcast is a joint program of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire and World Oregon.
Your co-hosts and producers are Andrea Castillo, Program Officer at World Oregon, and Tim Horgan, Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire.
The audio editor is Tim Horgan.
Our theme music is We Are One by Scott Holmes Music.
Thank you so much for listening, and don't forget to subscribe and leave us a comment. Until next time.